In this episode, I am joined by Professor William Rory Dickson, an Associate Professor of Islamic Religion and Culture at the University of Winnipeg and author of Dissolving into Being, the Wisdom of Sufi Philosophy. Professor Dickson takes a deep dive into the life and works of Jalāl ad-Dīn Muḥammad Rūmī, a 13th century Sufi poet whose works have become famous all around the world. Professor Dickson recounts the fascinating life of Rumi, including his flight from Mongol invasion, his education in Islamic law, his life-changing encounter with the wild mystical dervish Shams-i Tabrīzī, and his far-reaching legacy in Asia and beyond. Professor Dickson also explores the anti-Rūmī movements within modern Islam, challenges criticisms of Coleman Barks' popular renderings of Rumi's verse, and explores the controversial Sufi metaphors of intoxication by wine and passionate desire to describe the practitioner's relationship with God. So without further ado, Professor William Rory Dickson. Professor William Rory Dickson, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be back.
I'm so pleased to see you again, and the last two episodes we did were so fascinating. So fascinating, and this one proves to be, I think, just as, if not more, fascinating. And we're going to talk today about two main themes, interrelated themes. And that first theme is Rumi. Who was he? And also Rumi's reception in the West. He was voted, in one year anyway, as America's favorite poet. And that's due to the works of people such as Coleman Barks, who have translated him into English and popularized him, others too. And some of those works have been controversial, actually. Questions about, as was often the case with translations. And so a little bit about the reception of Rumi in the West, we're going to dive into that as well. And also the metaphors of Sufism that are used throughout its literature and certainly appear in Rumi. Passionate desire, intoxication on wine. These apparently carnal metaphors are somehow cast in a spiritual, devotional light. How does that work, and what's that all about? So these are some of the items on our menu for today. So perhaps we could start with Rumi himself.
Yeah, so I think they're great themes, and to start with Rumi is a very good place to start. As you know, with some of our previous discussions, some of my work has been on Ibn Arabi, and sometimes I've heard it put that Rumi and Ibn Arabi are sort of the two wings of the Sufi tradition. And there's also been an argument made that they've been saying very much the same thing. Ibn Arabi more in prose and Rumi more in poetry, though we should say that both have works falling in either category. So Rumi is coming out of Central Asia and was basically a refugee from the Mongol invasions, which are still really something that echo in a lot of the cultural memories of medieval, those societies that experienced the medieval Mongol invasions. And so Rumi ends up in present-day Turkey. And one of the things that I thought was useful to point to about his life is that, like his father, he was trained as a Muslim religious scholar. And so this is something that maybe isn't known as well in the West, when Rumi is encountered more strictly for his poetic works. The context of those works isn't always well appreciated. And I think that's something that, fellow scholars in my field or Muslims in general will sometimes want to push back against, is a kind of universalist, almost kind of hippie Rumi, which they think, I think correctly, it doesn't really resonate with who he was historically. Now, at the same time, though, and I'll point to this as well, I think sometimes there are also efforts in this desire to counter the kind of universalistic hippie version of Rumi, to kind of sanitize him a little bit and make him a little bit too clean-cut Orthodox Muslim, which, in some respects, I don't think is 100% accurate either. And so, to start, somebody who has an education, a thorough education in the traditional Islamic sciences, as they were known. So he would have been, and you see this in his poetic works, deeply familiar with the Quran and really referencing that text in various ways, explicit and subtle. Very, very familiar with the traditions, the reports about what the Prophet Muhammad would have said or done. And then also Shari'ah, or Islamic law. And this is especially something that would be unfamiliar to folks who might be reading some English translations. He was also highly trained in the Islamic legal tradition, and that would have been a discipline that he taught as well. So there is a kind of orthodox Islamic grounding to Rumi, which I think many contemporary Muslims point to. And I'll also say there's a very good reason for wanting to emphasize his Muslimness, and it's in part to combat a kind of Islamophobic phenomena, these things that happen when, the people who flash the symbols, like you think of ISIS, Islamic State, right? And some Muslims like to call them the non-Islamic State, or, they have this Arabic acronym Daesh, which kind of sounds bad in Arabic, and this is meant purposefully to try to discredit their claims. Some people see it as a kind of, I set up a, crudely painted M outside of my house and start selling homemade burgers that I'm calling McDonald's. And you're going, well, sure, you've got the symbol, but you're not really connected to what this thing is. And so because these individuals often get centered as kind of, oh, well, that's Islamic, to have Rumi then be de-Islamified, what starts to happen is you get this incredibly imbalanced understanding of the tradition, where the sort of violent sensational gets foregrounded, whereas some of the most important, we can say, icons of the Islamic tradition, or some might even see, the highest expressions or greatest fruits of this tradition, get somehow de-Islamified, at least in Western public consciousness. And so that then can lead to a very imbalanced view that understandably generates, fear and these kinds of things. So I definitely sympathize with folks who are trying to point to this fact that Rumi was somebody, we can say, like pickled in the Islamic traditions quite deeply. Now, where his story takes a fascinating turn, and this is also important for listeners to appreciate, things that I've pointed to a little bit in our previous discussions, that, Sufism really has this range of historical expression. And so when sometimes people want to know, is it like Orthodox Islamic? Is it kind of wild and, countercultural and rebellious and antinomian? And well, all of the above, historically. You really do see different expressions of Sufism that were very much grounded in the quote unquote Orthodox Islamic institutions. Many of the great leaders and teachers of the Islamic legal and theological universities were themselves Sufi teachers. I mean, that the historical record on that is expansive. However, there were also these folks, the Qalandars or wandering dervishes. And they tended to really not follow anybody's playbook whatsoever. Some of them were probably hucksters, just as, of course, you would get people ensconced in official institutions can be hucksters as well in their own way. So this problem of a fake isn't one that's, monopolized by any particular expression of Sufis. But certainly with the wandering dervishes, there were rooms for people just wandering around, pierced, half naked, high, and begging and calling themselves Sufis. But some of them appear to have been very profoundly realized spiritual beings. And one of these was Shams, which means sun in Arabic. And Shams-i-Din would have been his full first name, which means son of the faith or son of the religion. And there are a lot of Islamic names that have something with a deen. And that deen is an Arabic word that means something like your way of life, your religion, your faith. And so Shams-i-Din is the son of religion. Tabrīzī, because he was from Tabriz. And so Rumi, being a well-established sort of straight-laced Orthodox Islamic teacher, encounters this wild wandering dervish. And there are various stories that kind of resonate, I think, with some of that I've come across in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition as well, about, some kind of, a Nalanda professor, straight-laced, who encounters a kind of wild, in Sufi terms, dervish type person, and sort of realizes that, they know the words, but not the meaning, right? And that is very much the kind of encounter that's reported with Rumi and Shams. And basically what happens, from what we can understand, is that Rumi experiences a deeper level of realization and really love. You know, this phenomenon of love with falling in love with realization and enlightenment and God through an embodiment of it. You know, and this is important in a lot of various traditions. You know, I can think of the devotion to the guru, or in the Islamic tradition to the sheikh. And some Sufi paths even have a three-stage annihilation of the self through love: annihilation of the self in the sheikh, annihilation of the self in the prophet, and annihilation of the self in God. So, you know, Rumi experiences this kind of transformative encounter, and him and Shams become inseparable. And because Rumi is a kind of you know, institutional figure, this leads to a lot of problems, a lot of jealousies, and people are kind of wondering what's happening to this perfectly well-established, straight-laced scholar who's now hanging out with this, you know, disreputable dervish. And there's a great story too, and I love how this brings some of these themes together. So, you know, whereas Rumi is, as I've said, a kind of orthodox Islamic scholar, Shams is this wild dervish who doesn't really follow the rules, so to speak. And so some of the other clerics hear that Shams drinks alcohol. And, you know, alcohol is you can basically say universally prohibited in the Islamic legal tradition. There was like one small opinion in the early developments of the tradition that said, as long as you don't get drunk a little bit is okay. But that quickly got, you know, sort of trampled by the much stronger arguments, at least from the Islamic texts, that in fact it was prohibited. So Shams is drinking, and some of these clerics, apparently from what we know, you know, come up to Rumi and say, oh, so you've got this great spiritual master, but he, you know, he's drinking. And Rumi responds to them in a really fascinating way. He draws upon the Islamic legal tradition and its arguments to refute them. And he says, well, in the Islamic legal tradition, because water is really important for purification, for prayer, right? You make wudu, which is washing before prayer. You need to know about the purity of water. You know, when does a bowl of water become impermissible to use to purify yourself with? So there were these discussions of, you know, if alcohol is considered to be a forbidden and therefore impure substance, how much alcohol can be in water before you can no longer use it to wash yourself for prayer? And so Rumi says to them, you know, Shams follows the rule of the river. He said you could dump gallons of wine into a river and it's still permissible to use for washing for prayer. He said, but if a drop of beer falls in a puddle, you know, you can't use that anymore. So he said, you scholars are puddles. It's completely forbidden for you. He said, Shams is a river. He can drink as much as he wants. He's not going to compromise his spiritual purity, right? So he's kind of drawing upon these Islamic legal arguments to counter them. And so this is also where we kind of start to get this thought of the whirling, and there's some thought that maybe, you know, Rumi was doing this ecstatically, but it's really with his son that we get his teachings formalized into an order, where you start to see some of these rituals being incorporated. But at some point in Rumi's life with Shams, just to kind of touch back on that, apparently Shams is either exiled or possibly murdered. I mean, there's some fogginess about the historical details there. But, you know, Rumi, in longing, starts writing these great epic poems. And so his Methnawi, his Divan, Shams-i Tabrīzī, some of these are amazing works, really. I mean, and it's fascinating, I think, for anybody to read them from whatever spiritual tradition, because one of the gifts that Rumi had was to really encapsulate fairly either complex, I would say, philosophical ideas or spiritual teachings into a very condensed, brief, beautiful, you know, quatrain or something like that. So really, you know, wonderful works that also I think people in the West don't always appreciate, have been completely integral to Persian-speaking cultures now for centuries. You know, and I've met people who are from Iran, and because of the problems with the Iranian government that a lot of Iranians feel, there can be a real alienation from Islam, you know. And I've met Iranians who, they say, oh, what are you doing? And I'm a professor of Islamic studies, and Almost like, why would you be that? They almost find it kind of, they associate it so negatively with that government. But then if you ask them about Rumi, I mean, they can just start reciting, lines of Rumi and Maulana, as he's called, our master, Mevlana or Maulana. They refer to him as our master, and really, so he's been so integrated into the culture through those works. So you've got kind of, if we're thinking of Rumi and his legacy, then we've got these poems that really are really poetic odes, lengthy works, and some discourses that have been recorded as well, that really illustrate this way of love, right? And we'll maybe get to that in a bit too. This aspect of the Sufi tradition that really focuses on love and passion and desire. But then, of course, you get the order, right? So his son and later generations of followers formalize his teaching into what's known as the Mevlevi or Maulawi Sufi order. And that's where we get the kind of whirling practice that is eventually developed, especially in the Ottoman context. So that's maybe just a little bit to lay out about Rumi himself, and also just to maybe one final thing I'll say about that. So he's so pickled in the Islamic tradition and its traditional sciences, including the law, but also with his encounters in Shams and in his writings, really, I think tries to push back against a formulaic, formalistic understanding of religion. And so there are ways in which I'm sure some of the more orthodox minded would take issue. Rumi was also very explicit in some of his works. He would send really hilarious insults to his enemies that certainly celebrities aren't going to get tattooed on their side, that you find in some of his poems. He could be very kind of crude in some ways. So he was, a very earthy writer in some respects. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just say this and then we can move on to where else you'd like to go. But I think a really fine illustration, and it's one I included in my book, of Rumi's approach was a story he told about his father. And his father was also, besides being a religious scholar, was something of a mystic as well. And his father was in a spiritual state. He had become completely absorbed in the contemplation of God. And his followers were around him and experiencing. And if anyone, I'm sure yourself or your listeners have had the good fortune to be in the presence of somebody in a powerful spiritual state, it's visceral. I mean, it's something that is very, very tangible. And so Rumi's father was in this state, and his students were surrounding him and kind of, we might say, blissing out. And the call to prayer comes. And so some of the students stay with Rumi's father, and some go to perform the prayer. Now, one of the ones who performs the prayer, he has a vision that he's following behind the Prophet Muhammad, but he's facing away from Mecca. This kind of a vision hits him that, even though, and of course in the Islamic tradition, all the formal prayers performed towards the Qibla or the direction of Mecca. And so he realizes that although he's performing a religious obligation, that the true Qibla, the true essence of Mecca, is the light of God, and his teacher is sort of emanating that light, and he has left the teacher. So even though he's fulfilling a formal religious obligation, he's doing so in a way that is taking him away from its purpose. So that that's just I think a story that illustrates how Rumi, being very much ensconced or enmeshed in this Islamic tradition, understood it in a way that was also critical of we might say a sort of, again, formalistic approach.
And when we think about Rumi, what time period are we thinking about? And I wonder if you might trace a little bit his movements. But before we began recording, you mentioned to me some interesting details about his movements throughout his life.
Yeah, so he would have, I believe he died in 1273, so 13th century. And again, right when the Mongol invasions were proving to be particularly devastating to Central Asia and the Middle East. And so Rumi was a part of a much larger wave. Really Central Asia for centuries was a real center of Islamic culture and spirituality. Some of the great Sufis first came from Khorasan, which is a region of Eastern Persia. And so Rumi comes from a place in Central Asia, and I've seen some debate over whether is it exactly Afghanistan or Tajikistan. And so in that region, there's I think different folks want to understandably claim Rumi, because again, his influence extends into any part of the world where there are Persian speakers. He's something like a Shakespeare for English speakers. Really one of the icons of that language, and one that a lot of folks are familiar with. And so he's part of this greater wave of folks who are fleeing these Mongol invasions and the devastation they're bringing. And so he eventually ends up in Konya, in what present-day Turkey, which again was a place that a lot of people from that part of the world that were experiencing the Mongol invasions were ending up. And I think it's also why it became such a rich repository of Islamic spirituality and philosophy. And interestingly, Ibn Arabi's probably foremost disciple, Sadr ad-Din al-Qunawi, and Qunawi or Qunawi means from Konya. So he was one who ended up there as well, and appears to have had some interactions with Rumi, which I find quite interesting, this kind of what's associated with the stream of philosophical Sufism and this sort of way of love or poetic Sufism kind of coming together with those folks. Yeah.
And you mentioned that there are certain things Rumi says that are rather explicit, or that more orthodox religious perspective may take issue with. I wonder what's coming to your mind when you're saying that.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can I'm trying to think of what one of his his insults are hilarious. I honestly feel like there should be a little bit more attention paid to them, just partly for the comedy value, which is I think an important part of life as well. I just recall reading at one point one of his insults, and it was something like 1,000 donkey farts in your beard or something like that. Like these just great kind of medieval Persian insults that you find. And again, I got kind of chuckled to myself when I'm thinking of like various celebrities getting quotes of Rumi tattooed, and I think I'm sure that's not going to be one that they choose, but that's partly to show that wouldn't necessarily be so much a problem with like orthodoxy, but maybe more this association with him is almost unearthly. And I think sure there's an aspect of Rumi that is profoundly transcendent, but I also really think it's important to point out that he was a very down-to-earth, flesh and blood human. And when it comes more to the question of orthodoxy, one of the main distinctions that Sufis made was between form and meaning. You see this repeatedly in their works, and this is also important when we talk about love. This world being a world of form and appearance and metaphor. And what is it a metaphor of? What is it an appearance of? What do these forms mean? And so Sufis really pointed to the wisdom of appreciating the meaning. And so one example of that would be, Rumi said repeatedly that, the story of grapes is a great example, and it's one that he tells. And it illustrates this very well. There's 4 individuals at a market. And do stop me if I shared this on one of our previous talks. I don't think so. But so there are these 4 individuals who go to a market, and one is Turkish, one is Greek, one is Persian, one is Arab. And they start saying, well, if we pool our money together, we can get more stuff. We can buy bulk. So let's do that and then get a bunch of something. So, the Persian says a word, let's get that. And the Turk says, no, I think we should get, and he says a Turkish word, so on and so forth, the Greek and the Arab, and they start fighting over what they should get. So an individual who is standing nearby overhears their conversation and says, give me your money, I'll come back and satisfy you all. Seems maybe kind of like a suspect offer, but they go for it. They give him the money, and he comes back with a big thing of grapes. And the Persian goes, that's what I was saying. And the Turk and the Greek go, but that's what I was saying all along. and it's a story that illustrates, the meaning in many respects. And I think this is something Rumi pointed to a lot about religion as well. Even though he himself was deeply grounded in the Islamic tradition, and the Mevlevi order to this day, besides the whirling, they will do the daily prayers, and they engage with the Quran, and it's a deeply Islamic phenomenon. But there was a very keen awareness that, when somebody says Allah, or somebody says Christ, or somebody says Buddha or Buddha nature, when those things are actually, when the meaning of them is encountered and experienced, everyone goes, that's what I've been saying all along. So I think that is one way in which, Rumi was pointing to, another example was, he said, everybody looks at the moon reflected in their well, and thinks that, that's it. But really, there's just one moon, and each person has their reflection of it. And even said, explicitly, when you follow back the meaning of all of these different teachings, you're looking at the same moon. And so I think that's something that Rumi really emphasized, that certain, quote unquote, orthodox theologians tended to want to draw those boundaries more explicitly between, here is the explicit, exclusive truth, and then here are all these deviations from it. And then again, the other thing I would say is that I think for Rumi, the Sharia, or the law, was certainly something that he saw, basic Islamic practices and teachings as a foundation for the path. But he saw it, I think, a bit more as a means to an end. I think and some approaches to Sufism, we can say, are much more Sharia oriented, and it's not as though Rumi ever really completely discounted it, but he tended to decenter it a little bit in some of his discussions. Yeah.
So the hippies weren't completely off the mark when they read a bit of universalism in some of Rumi's statements. And it wasn't just the hippies. We talked last time about certain orders, Inayat Khan and so on, who took a sort of somewhat more universalist stance when they got to the States.
Yeah, and see, this is where I think there's an important kind of nuance, and I've really in my work tried to do this, because I've kind of watched this this debate happen a little bit in my own studies as I'm doing literature reviews of how Sufism's been understood since really the first European writings on it. And there is such a universal, and as we've talked about before with Ibn Arabi, appreciating that fundamentally everybody looks at reality through their own self, and so everyone's always getting a piece of something that goes beyond them. And so there's, I would say, a really powerful universalism and pluralism is for sure there. And I think, at the same time, though, when if you travel to different parts of the Muslim world, and you might go to a Sufi meeting, even though they might be sharing some of these teachings, they're in a mosque, and they're praying, and so I think it's kind of holding both a little bit, and I think somehow appreciating both, or appreciating that even the diversity of expression that Sufism has had more, as we said with Shams, a kind of a dervish who might not be following all of the religious guidelines, but is seen as being a deeply realized human. And then you would have other Sufis who might be like the head of an Islamic legal theological college, who would be following very closely all of those guidelines. And I think being able to kind of appreciate that spectrum is really important to allow Sufism to be multiple in its expressions, historically and today. And again, even with a figure like Rumi, to allow for the fact that he was so grounded in the Islamic sciences and teachings, but also was somebody who had a profoundly universal vision, and also at times interpreted those teachings in ways that some of, again, the sort of establishment theologians might take issue with. Right?
Yeah, very interesting indeed. Thank you. And if we look now, or turn towards reception, that is to say, how Rumi's been received, his work's been received around the world, maybe we ought to start with his own time. How was he received in his own time and in the centuries immediately preceding him? And then perhaps we could march on from there to his
Mhm.
reception around the world, famously.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways, and again, there are various angles one can take on this, but one of the ways to think about it is to look at the development of his order. So again, I think we can sort of look at two legacies, right? The literary expression, and then also the order, both of which became extremely influential and widespread. Especially again and it's so interesting. There's a great book if anybody wants to dive deeper in this, and I think it's a very accessible book. I think it's a fantastic scholarly work, but it's also very accessible. And it's Shahab Ahmed wrote a book called "What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic," and it's richly academically grounded, but also I think so accessible and readable. But he really talks about this Balkan to Bengal area where Persian language was the language of high culture. So whether you were Turkish or Arab or speaking Urdu, if you were one of the scholars, if you were one of the royals, it was seen as being, a sign of a good education, that you were well read in Persian, and so you would get the great Persian poets like Hafiz and Rumi, and he really talks about how this language was just assumed. Like, you could just drop these quotes to people in conversation, whether they were coming from Konya in Turkey or whether they were, coming from somewhere in present day, Pakistan or Afghanistan or Syria, and you would find people who were really just deeply familiar with these works. And so Rumi's works certainly proliferate, but also Sufi orders played a big role in this as well. Various orders, especially some of the most, again, kind of quote unquote orthodox orders, the Naqshbandis, for instance, who become a really important Sufi order. And the Naqshbandis tended to emphasize adherence to the Shari'ah more than some other orders, but they were also seen as transmitters of some of the high culture of the Sufi tradition, which included the works of Rumi, also Ibn Arabi. And these things had a real cachet. So certainly the royal elites often wanted to surround themselves with people who really knew these works. And so when we think of Rumi's order, what is so fascinating is, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, different orders proliferated in different cultural contexts. Some were more, the rural, the nomadic, tribal context. You'd get certain Sufi orders flourished. And I think Sufis had a very keen sense of shaping spirituality for particular peoples. So you develop a rural, nomadic, tribal Sufism, and you also develop an urban, high culture, artistic Sufism. And that's really what the Mevlevi order becomes. Rumi's order proliferates in urban centers in the Ottoman Empire. So you get these lodges, and you get, these increasingly sophisticated forms of what we would now call Turkish classical music that is played to accompany the sema, the whirling practice that they do, which is now kind of the global icon of Sufism, is the whirling dervish, which again is actually quite limited to that order. You rarely find other Sufi orders who engage in that particular practice. It's really something that took shape in the Ottoman context. But I mean, the Mevlevis were widespread throughout the Ottoman Empire, found in most of the major urban centers. There were close associations with the Ottoman imperial court. There was so yeah, they really became a key node in the high culture of the Ottoman Empire, and I think would have been celebrated as some of the highest expressions of Islamic spirituality and culture. And I think one of the things that's so fascinating about the contemporary Islamic scene is, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, with the collapse of the Mughals and the Safavids and these sort of traditional or pre-modern, somewhat pre-modern to early modern empires, you also see this patronage of Sufism start to be lost. And anti-Sufi movements come to the fore, which are now called kind of the Salafi, Wahhabi. And so for so many Muslims today, there's been a quite a radical forgetting of just how important and central Rumi was to, really the longest running Islamic dynasty, without question, were the Ottomans. Somewhere in the literally the year 1300 to 1920, so sort of solid 6th century run. and were so deeply Sufi. I mean, the Ottomans loved Ibn Arabi. He was sometimes seen as the patron saint of the Ottoman Empire. As we've just discussed, the Ottoman elites were so deeply integrated with Mevlevi teachings and culture and the actual order. Some of the Ottoman elites would have been personal students of Mevlevi sheikhs. And so I find it so interesting that now, and when I'm teaching about Islam and I mention something about Rumi or Ibn Arabi or Sufism, you can have a lot of students kind of like, this doesn't have anything to do with Islam. Like, what are you talking about? So that also brings us to this whole question of the reception of Rumi in the West, right? It's almost like just as there's a kind of, at least for some Muslims, a forgetting of Rumi and Sufism more broadly, there's an embrace now of Rumi, but in a different way, where and I maybe we'll jump into this with Coleman Barks as well, because again, the nuance here I find is often missed. And I think there's something really quite sad about that. And I maybe as an academic, there's a certain frustration with the inability to have nuanced conversations publicly. And so I should probably thank you for this long form, kind of discussion. I think is beautiful because it allows us to have them. And so you kind of get this either, Coleman Barks, yes, he does something that I think is ultimately brilliant. He takes Rumi's works, which already were translated into English by Orientalist scholars. And, apparently, I think one of his poetic colleagues, and his name is escaping me at this point, said something to Barks about, releasing Rumi from his cage, being kind of trapped in this kind of dry academic translations that weren't really offering much of the power and spirit of the original Persian works. And so starting, probably in the late 70s, early 80s, as I understand it, Coleman starts translating. And translating maybe isn't exactly the right word. He starts reworking translations of Rumi's poetry into a kind of more Walt Whitman style, very kind of American free verse kind of poetry. And I think in some respects, he successfully, releases these birds from their cage. I think there's an argument to be made that in several cases, he does this very well. Now, where there is, I think, room for critique, especially for those who are coming from cultures that value Rumi, is, there's a move away from some of the original language. And I started looking at this myself. I mean, I studied Arabic. I don't read Persian, but because the script is so similar, I can kind of recognize various terms. So I started looking at some of the original Persian, and you can kind of see where there are changes made that, and I think I understand why Coleman was doing this. He was taking out explicitly Islamic references. Like Rumi has this a verse that says, beyond iman and kufr, beyond faith and unbelief, there is a field, and so, people aren't going to really resonate necessarily in 1980s America with these Islamic, really legal terms for one's sort of status, and so he'll change that, and so you get a kind of a de-Islamification, which again I understand he's trying to communicate. He's trying to say there is a beautiful universal meaning here, but there are a lot of references to Quranic verses and Hadith, and the North American reader of the 80s or 90s, when some of these books were coming out, is going to have very, very little familiarity with them, and it might prove to be an obstacle to appreciating the beauty of what's there. And I think the other thing I'll say is that it's not, and I may have mentioned this before in our previous talks, it's not always well known, but Coleman Barks was himself a practitioner of the Sufi way. And as I understand it, was a student of Baba Muhyiddin, who was a really amazing Tamil Sufi master who settled in North America and is now buried outside of Philadelphia. And so, I think Coleman Barks was sensitive to the Sufi tradition, and I don't think of him as a kind of, new age, complete flaky distorter of something. I think he's actually done some really amazing work. However, I think that for a fuller appreciation of Rumi, there is room. I think you could almost use Barks's works as a doorway, if you will. They're an entry point, which are important in and of themselves. People who might not have any background in this stuff, it can be a wonderful entry point. But there's room then to have translations, and again, his works aren't technically translations, to get some, and these have come out more in recent years. Translations that stick a bit closer to the Persian, and then maybe have a commentary that helps unpack some of those references that Rumi has to a whole literary world that he's steeped in, that we are no longer steeped in. So, to me, it's not as though you have one or the other. You don't just say, okay, well, Barks, you've taken translations and you've added your own kind of American twist to them, and so now there's nothing of Rumi left. I don't think that's fair, but I think it is fair to say that there's room for us to appreciate more who Rumi was, his Islamic context, the sort of rich cultural spiritual tradition that he was embedded within. Let us appreciate those sort of Sufi Islamic contexts more, and maybe get a better understanding of the original texts. So to me, there's room for all of that. But again, somehow that gets lost, and you'll see this kind of Western de-Islamification of Rumi. It's all this, or there's this sense of Rumi that actually does happen, that some people in the West have, where they're like, oh, what does he have to do with Sufism or Islam? So that's a problem as well.
Yes, I think this is these dynamics are at play when everyone engages with the text from a different time to one's own, different culture to one's own, and certainly a different language.
Yeah.
We can think of many, many texts like that. Homer, for example, lots of references in there. And so in translating Homer, there are different approaches. There are approaches that try to stick to the Greek, for example, but then that's fine up to a point, but there are certain references that won't make sense to a reader today intuitively. So what do you do with those references? Do you footnote them and retain them? Do you rewrite them? What about certain aspects of style or form, repetition that's used, alliteration, those sorts of things? Famously in Greek, and certainly famously in Sanskrit, for example, there are so many language-specific puns and so on that are crucial to the stylistic, to the style of those classic writings from those in those languages. How do you replicate that? You can't really replicate it. So you have to make some sort of a creative choice, and ideally indicate what you've done, so that people can see this is an attempt. And it can be only, I think a translation can only be an attempt. And so one might say, well, then one ought to really read these writers in the original to appreciate them fully. And that certainly will help a great deal. But even that alone isn't sufficient, because you could read the Persian, but do you get the references?
Exactly.
You can read the Persian, but do you understand what he's talking to, what he's gesturing to? One needs to do quite a bit of study around then to really, but even then there's speculation. Rumi's dead. We can't really ask him what he meant there. Maybe
what do you really mean by this?
Maybe he didn't exactly know. In other times we could read certain things that are there. You can get it out of it, but was it consciously put in there and so on. So these are, I think, dynamics that are ubiquitous with any translated literature, certainly, especially when it comes from a different place and a different time.
Yeah, and I think this applies as well. You'd also brought up as something to speak about was this sort of even, and we have talked a little bit about this, but Western Sufism in general. Again, when you look at like Hazrat Inayat Khan, or somebody who presents Sufism in a more universal way, and again, I just think there's so much room to allow for an understanding that if you're teaching at turn of the century, 1911, 1912 America, there's not a real openness or receptivity to Islam as such. At this time, it's associated with the terrible Turk in some respects, right? These kind of sense of the sick man of Europe and the declining Ottoman Empire, and all these sort of sensational tales about it. And so, I think much like we're discussing with translating a text, and I find this so fascinating. And really, my first book on living Sufism in North America, it was me actually talking to Sufi teachers and asking them about this challenge. How do you not even, translating a text, but translate teachings, into an idiom, into a cultural context in a way that both preserves the yeast that raises the bread, so to speak, the spiritual power, but makes it communicable to people who might not resonate. So, I mean, I'm even thinking of, I've always enjoyed the works of Chogyam Trungpa, who I in some ways, I still think, brilliant teacher. I reference spiritual materialism all the time. I'm like, that's, deeply, profoundly, concisely encapsulates a big problem in spiritual practice, and found these ways to take, his, again, being pickled in kind of traditional Buddhist teachings and then express it to hippies and other folks in the 70s. And so, but then of course there's a debate. Some might say, well, how far do you go in transforming the form of expression? And again, that whole question of form and meaning, and yet still transmit the meaning. And I've always found that such an interesting question, to see how different teachers negotiate that. And I find that's also the point at where you get different expressions of a tradition. Is one teacher will make, I think, a creative, ultimately, choice to say, well, I think we can do away with some of that, or we can reformulate it into this. And then another teacher will say, no, we need to stick more closely to the form for these reasons. And, you end up getting these different approaches. Yeah.
Certainly. Very interesting. I wonder if we might then pivot to metaphor then.
Yeah, sure.
And I'll quote you here from your book, Dissolving into Being, The Wisdom of Sufi Philosophy. You say, if you prefer your religion sober and static, sensible and scholarly, you may understandably get a bit perturbed when someone shows up claiming to have had a direct encounter with God that totally transcends rational categories and causes their hearts to overflow with love beyond their wildest imaginations. Some Sufis even expressed divine love in terms of passionate desire, which scandalized those theologians more prone to see God as a great king to be obeyed from afar, rather than an intimate companion of the heart. And that's to do with passionate desire. And elsewhere you write on intoxication. To access the deeper dimensions of the self, however, we need to break our addiction to shiny objects, the distracting draws and desires of our world, the metaphorical wines we get drunk on. To accomplish this, we don't need to somehow force ourselves to abandon the wines, but can instead find something much better to drink, after which the appeal of lesser varieties will naturally dissolve. So here we have passionate desire. Here we have intoxication on wine, these famous motifs of Sufi literature. What can we say about these?
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for sharing those quotes as well from the book. I appreciate that. And one of the things I wrote about in the book was that I've argued that Islam is a profoundly romantic tradition. If you think of Romanticism as a movement that is aesthetically oriented, that is oriented towards beauty and love as the highest truths, that leans towards poetry. And this in part is reflected in the cultural roots of the Islamic tradition, right? So maybe I'll jump back there and then kind of take us up a bit towards some of these metaphors. So what I find so interesting is if you go to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabs at that time universally acknowledged as having one major primary cultural expression that to this day is something that I think a lot of Arabs take pride in, and that was poetry. And it was, the Arab poetry is deeply fascinating. It's a lot of, and in a way, sometimes Muslims look at it as an example of an age of ignorance, because it was very braggadocio. It was also like, I think I've told my students it's a bit like gangster rap in a sense. It's like me and my group taking out enemies, no problem, getting all the money, getting all the girls, here's all my affairs. I'm a legend, I'm partying, spending all our money as quickly as we get it. You do get some of that stuff, right? And so Muslims would later look at this as a kind of, this is what the Prophet Muhammad had to reform, was this kind of like absolutely wild, violent, drunken kind of approach to life. But one of the things that I think is really kept is that a lot of this poetry is passionate love poetry. Some of the most famous of the Arabic odes is somebody standing at the campsite of his beloved. You had these pilgrimages that would happen to different regions. Mecca was one of them every year, and this would bring all the tribes together. So this is where young men and women could meet, people from outside the tribe, and love affairs would happen. And so, but then the tribes would go back to their quarters, and they might not see them for another year. So standing at the campsite of the lost beloved, right? This is one of the most commonly referred to situations that the Arab poet finds himself in. He's standing there and he can see the droppings from the animals, but now the wind is like blowing sand over it and the embers of the campfire, and he's inconsolable. He's literally crying, and his friends are saying, calm yourself, or other poetic expressions like, I wish I had two hearts, one that could be tormented by your love and one that I could escape from that torment. But I only have one heart, so I can't escape the torment. Death and life neither offer any kind of repose for me, right? So this, absolutely being kind of destroyed or annihilated in love. So the early Arabic context has this deep romantic streak. And what I think is interesting is the Quran itself comes out of that cultural context. And the Quran explicitly says that it's not poetry and that Muhammad is not a poet, because that was one of the cultural references. People are saying, oh, is this just like some kind of poetry? But the Quran is undoubtedly poetic. It's undoubtedly poetic, a deeply poetic work. It's filled with rhythm and rhyme. Much of it rhymes. And much of it is, at least in my experience, once I learned the Arabic, and there is also something there just to say about translation. The Quran is notoriously difficult to translate, and picking up an English translation can be disappointing. But the Arabic is quite beautiful, and that was something that really moved the initial readers. And so you get the sense of, I would say, romanticism and emphasis on love that's already built into the culture that the Quran comes from. The Quran has a select few verses on love, but ones that are really drawn upon by Sufis to understand the possibility of relating to God through love. And then these other cultures that Islam becomes fused with over time, like Persian culture, also had a long history of love poetry and also wine, wine songs, because there were, especially in the elite context, these great parties, and they would drink wine and they would sing songs. And so in some sense, what you have with Sufism, you could argue, is a kind of spiritualization of cultural romanticism. And in a way, for them, it was seen as quite natural, as you mentioned in that quote from the book. I think Sufis basically see, and this gets down to Sufi philosophy as well, that there is one ultimate reality, one being, and everything that exists in the world is appearance, is metaphor for the one. So manyness itself is a metaphor. You and I and all of the objects and things, they're all seen as, yes, existing, but in appearance. Much like if you take, you're at a campfire and you take a little stick and you light it in the night and you spin it around, you see a circle. Now the circle appears for sure, but in one sense, it's not really there. It's an appearance. And so that metaphors like that, Sufis have used to describe our phenomenal reality, the world that we find ourselves within. So what they would say is, actually everything that you love, that wine, that woman, that new blazer, whatever it is but a metaphor, is but an appearance of one true beloved. And so, knowing God, or knowing God's love, is like finding absolutely the best wine, the best drug, the best romance in the universe, because all of those things that you love because they reflect in a infinitesimally small way this absolutely immense, beautiful reality that is really at the source of them all. And this can also be why, when you think of Neoplatonism, there's some interesting connections here, right? Moving from, asking, well, what do all beautiful things share? Well, they share beauty. Well, what's beauty as such? can I know that? Can I know the form of beauty, the form of the good, the form of the true, which becomes eventually, this idea of contemplating the one, that everything is but a reflection of, right? So I think one of the ways that Sufis thought that they could really spiritualize and work with these rich cultural traditions of romantic poetry, passionate desire, drunkenness and wine was and as I've also mentioned before, there's also a real visceral connection, for anybody who's been in the presence of a spiritual teacher who is genuinely realized. Intoxication is a good word for what you experience. I mean, it can be, the intensity of the energy, and generally you can say a love energy. It's very fair, I think, to describe it as wine, and as the best wine there is. So I think there's that both a kind of spiritualizing these traditions of romance and love and desire and wine, and then also their usefulness in actually describing certain spiritual encounters and states. Yeah.
You refer to Neoplatonism there, and certainly,
Yeah.
the more you talk, the more Platonic that sounds. Thinking of the dialogue Phaedrus, in which Plato expresses this idea through his characters that the pleasures of life are a kind of remembering of this one, because they have this idea of reincarnation and so on, and that the mistake is to miss the remembering and take the temporary mundane pleasure as the source of the pleasure, but really what it is, it's a reflection of a remembering, it's a reorientation. And so then that makes me think of tantric traditions, which use not only intoxication and sexual union or sexual desire as metaphors, for poetic metaphors for spiritual practice and spiritual experience, but they also use them as vehicles for that. Intoxication.
Yeah.
Does that happen in Sufism at all? Do we see intoxication?
Yeah.
Do we see, quote unquote, Sufi sex as a path to God or something like that?
Yeah. Amazing question. And this is something I've written on a little bit too in the last chapter on Muhammad, because he is really seen by Sufis as an icon of integrating the sensual and the spiritual. And I think this is a really important point. And first of all, I'll speak to what we were talking of with this idea of loving the one and the metaphor. So one of the things that Ibn Arabi said, and I wrote a bit about this, was this whole question of, do you need to renounce the world? And I find this very, very interesting, as you're mentioning too, with sort of sutra and tantra traditions in Buddhism. You can, monastic traditions in Christianity. Sufism has never had monasticism per se. I shouldn't say necessarily never. The Bektashis in the Ottoman context were an order that have some Orthodox Christian connections, I think, historically, and you do have some celibate babas, as they're called, celibate leaders, but generally speaking, monasticism isn't a phenomenon that you find in the Islamic tradition. And I think there's also this focus on realizing God through things. So the way that Ibn Arabi put it, he said, yes, sometimes, he said, first of all, there's no way, like retreat or khalwa is the Arabic term for leaving the world. And often it's still practiced by Sufis, 40 days and nights. You go in a meditation cell and you just make dhikr, you just repeat the names of God or some other form of meditation. And he said, sometimes you need to do that to discover the reality of the one, within yourself. And so then you can see the one in the world. But he said, there's really no place to retreat away from God. Because if all of this is a metaphor, an expression of the one, you can dig anywhere in the earth and you're going to hit water. And I actually looked into that because I heard that analogy. Like, is that true? And apparently the world's deepest hole is in Murmansk and there's water at the bottom of it or something. So they're like, yes, apparently, they confirm anywhere you dig, there's water. So there's the sense of there's nowhere that you can't find God. And that, if you can appreciate, and here's the key, if you can appreciate the way in which the things that you love in this world are metaphors, are expressions, are reflections of the one, then they become a vehicle. But if you can't, they become an obstacle. And so I think that is really the rub, so to speak. That's where you get this sense of, well, if these things are going to prove to be totally distracting and destabilizing, then you get the kind of renouncer approach, right? Whether that's in Sufism, there have been approaches that lean that way, and of course, monastic traditions and what have you. But if there's a sense in which you can kind of transmute, through awareness or knowledge or understanding of the deeper realities of things, then those things become a vehicle, right? So now within the Sufi tradition, getting back to this question of sexuality and things, I find it very interesting. Ibn Arabi has this idea that every spiritual expression, every, let's say, saint, is really expressing a prophetic mode. So there's this idea in the Islamic tradition, there are 124,000 prophets sent by God from Adam to Muhammad. And each has a style of spirituality. Each has a mode, a way. One might be more stern and one might be more, freewheeling, So there's the sense of different modes. So there's like a Jesus mode of spirituality called Isawi in Arabic. And Ibn Arabi says, when I first was on the spiritual path, I was Jesus mode. I inherited my spiritual expression from Jesus. And he actually considered Jesus to be one of his first spiritual teachers, who appeared to him in visionary form and taught him ways of the Sufi path. Sufis, of course, love Jesus immensely as an icon of spirituality. But he says, when I was Isawi, when I was following the Jesus way, he said, I had no interest in sex. I was an ascetic, like I was just the sensual, the sexual. I had no interest in it whatsoever. But he said, then when I inherited my spirituality from Muhammad, I came Muhammadan. He said, that is when I married and I saw the deep wisdom in sexuality in particular. And one of Ibn Arabi's focuses when he discusses Muhammad in his book, The Gemstones of Wisdom, and I discuss this at length in my book as well, is he chooses a hadith that at first glance can seem a bit strange. But when you look at his commentary on it, and the more I thought about it, it made a lot of sense. So the Prophet Muhammad said, 3 things of your world have been made beloved to me, which also Ibn Arabi pointed to. He didn't say, I love them. They were made beloved to me for the wisdom that they have in them. Women, romance, cologne, perfume, beautiful scent, and prayer. Also thought it was interesting that he included prayer as part of this world. But if we think of, especially in the Islamic tradition, embodied prayer, right? It's something you do with your body. Now, one of the things that Ibn Arabi notes is that all of these can be venues for appreciating the spiritual through the sensual. Right? So what Ibn Arabi said was, if you appreciate romance and sexuality, he said, not just for the physical, the natural, if it's just base instinct, he said, you're missing the point completely. He said, you're basically pursuing the dead body of the thing. If you're just out there, going, oh, I think this person is sexually attractive and I want to hook up with them. He's going, well, you're kind of missing the point. But if you appreciate the deeper meaning of that, he said, it's actually one of the highest ways of contemplating God. And for him, that was also in women in particular. I've kind of wondered if that applies to, does that mean that when women are contemplating men in that way, it's the same? And again, I can't go back and ask Ibn Arabi precisely what he meant by that. But for him, he saw women in particular and the romantic relationship in particular as a deeply, deeply valuable site for witnessing the manifestation of God in perfection, in a kind of perfect way. And then if you go to beautiful scents, so Muhammad loved, he would, and to this day, I mean, this is deeply embedded in Islamic culture. You can go to a mosque and they'll pass around some kind of cologne stuff that you put on, or the Kaaba in Mecca can be washed with rose water, this beautifying thing through scent. But when I started looking at it, scent is for sure the most spiritual sense. Biologically, it's most directly connected to that part of our brain that's associated with emotion and memory. People talk about this, you catch a scent of something and it takes you to a world of years past in your life. Memory, and it can bring back a flood of memories so much more powerfully than a sight or a sound. So this idea, again, of encountering the spiritual through the sensual, And then, of course, if you think of embodied prayer or any kind of embodied ritual, right? These are all embodied sensual things that have wisdom in them because they can be profound vehicles for us to encounter the spiritual. And so I think what Ibn Arabi is saying there, to get kind of, again, back to your question on this question of sexuality in Sufism, for him, he felt like a complete spirituality is one that is able to follow Muhammad in seeing the wisdom of romance and sexuality as being actually particularly powerful vehicles for spiritual contemplation and realization. And he acknowledged that when he started out on the path, he wasn't in a place to appreciate that. He was almost a natural ascetic. He was almost kind of, he said, like actually repelled from wanting to pursue that and wondered why his prophet did. But he said, once I, inherited my spiritual style from Muhammad, he then understood and saw the wisdom in it. So
that's very interesting. In the quote that I read, one
yeah.
of the quotes from your book, you mentioned scandalized, that some of these ideas scandalized certain theologians.
Yes,
And
yes.
I'm wondering, of what you've been saying lately,
Yeah.
what if any of that is possibly scandalous to some within Islam?
Very good question. So one of the things too, and I think that in that quote, talking about God as a distant king to be obeyed from afar, this is something you find in the monotheistic traditions, right? So if you're thinking of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, there is a tendency to want to see God as being very separate from or distant from the world. And Ibn Arabi always said, like, yes, they're emphasizing transcendence. Like God is totally beyond thought, category, very classic Sufi saying, whatever you think about God, he's that and he's other than that. Whatever any religion, any faith believes about reality, reality is that and it's other than that. So this sense of the absolute transcendence of the real beyond any idea, expression. And so there's also the sense in the Islamic tradition, of course, with the Sharia and the law, that yes, there is a way in which obeying God's commandments is a kind of a wisdom. And you think of the Bible, the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, or and yeah, I think unfortunately, again, with translation, sometimes fear isn't exactly the right word, but a sort of a respect or a respect for the immensity of reality and our fragility in the world. I mean, there's different ways you could put this. So in Islamic theology and philosophy, then this is interesting. It's not just that the theologians wanted to say God is a great king, he's way beyond us, you just obey him and that's it. You also had Islamic philosophers who wanted to say that, God is a kind of almost like a rational principle. And not really wanting to too much engage with this idea that you could really know God in an intimate way. And this, of course, is what the Sufis were known for saying. They said, yes, you can know something of God, quite limited, through the intellect. You can know something of God for sure through tradition and language, but that also you could know God in a more direct experiential way. Right? Ma'arifa was the term most often used by Sufis, which means a kind of direct knowing. You could probably translate it as gnosis. But the idea was that also when you know this reality, just as we're saying, if you discover that it's in fact the source of all your beloveds, an absolutely head over heels love follows almost inevitably. And it can be all consuming. There was also seen as being a danger of insanity in love. And some Sufis said, they even had a word for those who've gone completely mad in love with God, and now they can't take care of themselves and they're not eating properly. They're just wandering around mumbling things, but it was seen as a danger. And ideally, again, Muhammad is seen as the icon or the paradigm, the archetype for integrating a profoundly ecstatic love with an outward sobriety and functionality in the world, which became the goal. So, and again, building on this romantic, poetic, cultural roots that Islam has and that different cultures in the Islamic sphere contain, Sufis also thought it was appropriate to talk about lover and beloved when it comes to God. And yes, so definitely a romantic overtone. One of Ibn Arabi's most famous poems is called Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, which means the translator, who's speaking of translation, of the most passionate desires. Like, how do you do that? How do you take a profoundly ecstatic experience and try to put it into words. How do you translate it into language? Sufis would ultimately say you can't. Rumi would always say, I write about love, and then, I'm always ashamed when I experience it. I'm ashamed of what I've tried to do, because you just can't. There's the embarrassment of language and trying to encompass it. So, I think there was this sense of talking about God in that way. For theologians who, as I said, they want a scholarly, here are the categories, God is up there, we are down here, he has commandments, we can map them out fairly clearly. Our job is simply to follow them. And then you have somebody, stumbling out of the Sufi tavern, right? Completely drunk and talking about God as a lover, talking about this, and they use the metaphor of this famous Arabic ode of Majnun and Layla, which is a beautiful, beautiful poem. And Layla is the woman and Majnun is the guy. But Layla also means night, and night is also a great metaphor for gnosis and passion. And Majnun actually literally means jinned, one who has a jinn, one who's been possessed or been made insane. Majnun is the one of the jinn who has a jinn. And so, this kind of way of speaking about God, that was definitely seen as scandalous. And to this day, I think there are many Islamic theologians who are kind of troubled by a kind of rending of the boundary between the transcendent and the immanent, or the sort of spiritual and sensual. But that's something that Sufis from very early on pursued, again, with different levels of understanding of how public you should be about that. One of the early Sufis, al-Hallaj, was executed by the Abbasid dynasty for a variety of reasons. He was definitely stirring up peasants and things like that, and they thought there could be danger of revolt, but for expressing some of these things very openly. And other Sufi teachers said, you're much better off to keep that private, because it's just not going to be understood. There are things that you're speaking of that if somebody doesn't have an experiential understanding of, it's going to sound completely nuts. So.
And so today, what would a scandalized theologian say about those views? How would they categorize them? Heresy, misunderstanding?
Yeah. No, it's a good question. I mean, I think there would be a sense of, maybe inappropriateness. It's inappropriate to speak of God that way. They could use a term like bid'ah, which means kind of like an innovation. That's not the way that and then Sufis would point, that's not the way that the scripture, the early community spoke of God. But Sufis do point to these few verses in the Quran that have some very interesting discussions of love, and one of is simply, he loves them and they love him. Those close to God. That it is a mutual love, and Sufis have always reflected on that love implies a kind of mutuality and an intimacy. But I think some would see that as being problematic. Some simply just have a more, I think, formalistic, legalistic approach, and really do want to say, look, there we have the commands, we've mapped them out, you simply follow them. And so it can be maybe even a style, but definitely I think they'd be scandalized by a sense of compromising God's transcendence, speaking of God in even kind of like erotic ways. It's just seen as totally inappropriate. But for the Sufis, it's seen as being extremely appropriate if you've had a direct encounter with that which you speak of. Yeah.
And what about wine then? I think this will be my last question. It's a metaphor, sure. Is it used as a sacrament in certain? Has it been used in certain Sufi gatherings or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, it's another really interesting question, and in a way, it's simple to answer, and it's basically no. Formally, it has never been used in a sacramental way. Now, I will say that, I mean, the whole question of alcohol in Islam is a very, very interesting one. And in some ways it's simple and in some ways it's not. As I said, there was a minority opinion in the Hanafi school of the four of the major Sunni schools of Islamic law. So you have the Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali. The Hanafis were the only one that had some sense that like maybe it was just like grape wine that was forbidden, but maybe other kinds of alcohol you could drink, but maybe just in small doses. But that pretty quickly got shot down. And the sort of general consensus was that alcohol is forbidden. Now, what's interesting, and again, Shahab Ahmed's book, What is Islam, does a great I think, job of discussing this. He talks about at an academic conference, and I think it's in Germany, and there's a Pakistani Muslim academic, and they're sitting down to dinner and with a German colleague, and they order wine. The German says something along the lines of, but you're Muslim. And he says, yeah. And he says, but you're drinking wine. He said, my family has drank wine for generations. And he says, I don't understand how that can be. And he says, I know you don't, but I do. I know it makes sense to me. Right. And so, no, certainly there are a great many Muslims who would definitely not touch alcohol. And I think probably the majority of Muslims historically have probably abstained. I think that's safe to say. But in certain cultures, particularly I'm thinking of the Balkans, I'm thinking of Iran, different parts of the Muslim world, there have been, especially among the elites, a comfort with drinking wine. I mean, and Shahab Ahmed in his book, he even points to, I think it was a Mughal ruler who had an Islamic wine cup. So he had this like beautifully carved wine glass that would have like, there's no God but God, like carved on it. So he was like literally drinking Islamically, which again, for a great many Muslims would be not possible. But in some contexts, there was this comfort. And he would sometimes in his journal say, I did the afternoon prayer and made sure I did that, and then I hit the wine. So kind of integrating this wine drinking with his practice. Now, I will say for Sufis, I think it's safe to say in the vast majority of cases, maybe Hafiz is an exception. I think there's some sense that Hafiz may have actually drank wine too, but definitely for Rumi, I think in the vast majority of cases, I'm pretty comfortable saying it's a metaphor, that they wouldn't have seen it as having a huge amount of spiritual value, literally speaking, but that it was a very, very good metaphor for encountering God and encountering the love of the divine, that it was such a profound wine that, they would say things like, it gets you so drunk, you forget both this world and the next. Earth and the heavens and the next world just completely evaporate in significance once you take a sip of this wine. So I would say I'm not really aware of Sufis who ever drank sacramentally. I think, again, there's a lot of evidence that Muslims have drank recreationally. I think some in the Bektashis, again, may have also been okay with drinking wine, even their teachers. But again, I don't think that would have done in a kind of ritualized way. My understanding is really that it's just seen as being a very, very useful and expressive metaphor for what the spiritual path can be like at certain points. And just one final thing too, and this just came to mind, but I thought I should mention this because I was doing a bit of reading recently on this. And one thing that Sufis also emphasized, and this is to maybe forestall an overly romantic sense of love, is they also said love is absolutely brutal. Love is they said, if you don't want any trouble, just don't fall in love. If you just want a nice, calm, chill life, don't become a Sufi. That love, it brings a lot of pain. It brings a lot of suffering. But they say, a lover welcomes it. Whatever the beloved does to them, it's welcome, bring it, because you're in love. They can't do any wrong. So if you fall in love with reality, if you fall in love with God, whatever shows up, whatever sufferings, whatever pain, and they say it will increase, more will be sent. If you're a true lover, you absolutely welcome it, but be prepared for some real suffering. This is the beloved is one who kind of annihilates those that love him. So I think that's important to point out too. Sometimes it's easy to fall into, it's just like love and you're thinking of the rose and not the thorn, so to speak. But Sufis were very, in their love poetry, spent a lot of time talking about how painful that can be, that path. So.
Very interesting. We could talk, I think, much longer on these subjects. Everything you say just inspires so many responses and questions, but this has been really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. And once again, I was reading earlier from Dissolving into Being, The Wisdom of Sufi Philosophy, your latest book. Really marvelous book it is too. Professor William Rory Dickson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.